Imagine the worst-case scenario. Marcus Rivera crouches in the skeletal remains of a suburban garage, watching ice crystals form on the inside of a shattered window, and knows with absolute certainty that the family of four huddled in the corner behind their makeshift lean-to will be dead by morning. The electromagnetic pulse that killed every circuit board on Earth 43 days ago has brought an early winter to the Pacific Northwest, dropping temperatures to 18 degrees Fahrenheit when it should still be autumn, and the father, a software engineer named David Chen, whose hands have never built anything more complex than IKEA furniture, has constructed a shelter that violates every principle of thermal protection Marcus learned during his decade training Marines to survive in hostile environments. The lean-to consists of cardboard boxes propped against the garage wall, covered with a blue tarp that's already collecting condensation on its underside, and Marcus can see the deadly mistakes from 15 feet away. No insulation layer, no air gap, no ground barrier, direct contact with the concrete floor that's currently conducting precious body heat into the frozen earth at a rate that will kill them long before the sun rises. David's wife, Sarah, holds their 6-year-old daughter, Emma, while their 10-year-old son, Lucas, shivers in a thin sleeping bag. And Marcus watches the family's breath form clouds in the garage that should be their refuge, but has become their tomb, because David built what looked like shelter without understanding that survival isn't about appearances, but about physics, heat retention, and the brutal mathematics of hypothermia. The temperature gauge Marcus salvaged from a camping store reads 17 degrees and falling. The wind outside howls through gaps in the garage door with a sound like the world ending, which it did 43 days ago. And Marcus faces the choice that has defined his existence since the collapse. Does he walk away from people who refused his advice 6 hours ago? Or does he tear down their death trap and rebuild it correctly, knowing that teaching someone to survive means first showing them how catastrophically wrong they've been? If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light from this survivor's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. This is the story of Marcus Rivera, a 35-year-old former Marine survival instructor who spent the first month after the electromagnetic pulse obliterated modern civilization trying to reach his sister in Vancouver, only to find an empty house and a note that led nowhere. With no family left to find and no purpose beyond the next sunrise, Marcus began doing what the Marines had trained him to do: adapt, overcome, and survive. In the frozen wasteland that the Pacific Northwest became after the power died and the nuclear plants melted down, and the ash from 1,000 fires created a nuclear winter that dropped temperatures 15 degrees below seasonal norms, Marcus discovered that survival knowledge meant nothing if he couldn't convince desperate people to abandon their misconceptions about shelter, water, and community. He became a ghost moving through the ruins of Seattle and Portland, trading his expertise for food, teaching techniques that separated the living from the frozen dead, and learning that the hardest part of surviving the apocalypse wasn't the cold or the hunger or the radiation zones. It was watching good people make fatal mistakes because they trusted intuition over physics. This is his testimony about the night he met the Chen family, and how their shelter failure became the beginning of something that might save dozens of lives if he could teach them fast enough, if they would listen, if the winter didn't kill them all first. Marcus had been tracking the Chen family for 2 days, ever since he spotted them scavenging in the ruins of a Walmart 20 miles east of Portland. They moved like most urban survivors, loud, inefficient, burning calories they couldn't replace, and he knew within minutes of observation that they were educated, middle-class people who had never missed a meal or spent a night without central heating. The father wore expensive hiking boots that had never seen a trail before the collapse. The mother carried a designer backpack loaded wrong with the heaviest items at the bottom, and the children moved with the distracted energy of kids who'd grown up with screens and structured activities. Marcus followed them because he recognized the trajectory. They were 3 weeks from death, maybe 4 if they got lucky, and his conscience wouldn't let him watch another family disappear into the statistics that haunted his dreams. He'd tried approaching them directly that first evening, emerging from the tree line, with his hands visible and his voice calm, offering to show them how to build a proper shelter before the temperature dropped below freezing. David Chen had thanked him with the polite dismissiveness of a man who'd spent his career solving problems with code and couldn't accept that the apocalypse required different expertise. Sarah had smiled with the exhausted wariness of a mother protecting her children from strangers, and the conversation had ended with Marcus watching them walk away toward a suburban neighborhood where they'd apparently claimed a garage as their territory. Now standing in the garage entrance as darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Marcus made his decision with the same clarity that had kept him alive through 2 deployments in Afghanistan and 43 days of collapsed civilization. He walked directly to the lean-to where the Chen family huddled, knelt down so his eyes were level with David's, and spoke with the flat authority of someone who'd pulled too many bodies from hypothermia situations. "Your shelter will kill you by morning," he said, and when David started to protest, Marcus continued with relentless precision. "Concrete conducts heat 30 times faster than wood. You're lying directly on it with no insulation. That tarp is trapping condensation that's already soaking into your cardboard, which will lose all insulating value within 2 hours. Your body heat is escaping through conduction into the ground, through convection into the air gaps you didn't seal, and through radiation into that metal garage door that's 15 degrees colder than the ambient air. You have maybe 6 hours before Emma goes into hypothermia, 8 before Lucas, 10 before you and Sarah. I can rebuild this shelter in 90 minutes and you'll all survive the night. Or you can maintain your pride, and I'll come back in the morning to find your bodies." The silence that followed Marcus's assessment stretched for 30 seconds that felt like minutes, broken only by the wind shrieking through the garage and Emma's small cough that sounded wet and dangerous. Sarah spoke first, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a mother who'd been terrified for 6 weeks straight. "Show us," she said. And David nodded with the defeated posture of a man watching his competence crumble, and Marcus moved with the efficient intensity of someone racing against physics and time. He started by pulling apart their lean-to, explaining as he worked, because teaching meant they might survive the next night without him. "Shelter isn't about having walls and a roof," he said, stacking the cardboard carefully, because they'd need it, but not how they'd used it. "Shelter is about creating a thermal envelope that traps your body heat and prevents the 3 types of heat loss: conduction, convection, and radiation. Right now you're losing heat in all 3 directions simultaneously, which means your body is burning calories trying to maintain 98.6 degrees in an environment designed to kill you." Marcus sent David to scavenge while he worked. Specific instructions delivered in the clipped cadence of a drill instructor. Gather every piece of foam, carpet, cardboard, or fabric within 100 yards. Focus on materials that create dead air spaces. Avoid anything wet or compressed. He sent Sarah and the children to collect dried grass, leaves, and pine needles from the area behind the garage, where a small yard had gone wild, emphasizing volume over selectiveness. "You want significantly more than you think you need," he told them. "Then double it, because insulation is about thickness and air pockets, not material type." While they scattered to their tasks, Marcus assessed the garage with a tactician's eye, noting the relatively intact section of wall in the back corner where the metal met concrete, the stack of old tires that could provide ground insulation, the wooden pallets leaning against the wall that would solve multiple problems simultaneously. The rebuild began with Marcus arranging 6 wooden pallets in an overlapping pattern on the concrete floor, creating a platform that lifted them 3 inches above the thermal sink that would otherwise drain their heat. He demonstrated the principle by placing his hand on the concrete, then on the pallet, letting David feel the temperature difference. Wood is a poor conductor, Marcus explained, which makes it an excellent insulator. These pallets create an air gap between you and the concrete, and that gap is what saves your life. On top of the pallets, he layered flattened cardboard boxes, shingle style, overlapping each piece to prevent gaps, creating a floor that would provide additional insulation and prevent body parts from pressing through the pallet gaps. David returned with an impressive haul: foam sleeping pads from abandoned homes, sections of carpet torn from floors, moving blankets, even a roll of bubble wrap that made Marcus nod approvingly. "Bubble wrap is phenomenal insulation," he said. "Each bubble is a trapped air pocket, and trapped air is the fundamental principle of every insulation system humans have ever created." Marcus built the shelter's frame using 2 pallets stood on edge, leaned against the garage wall at a 45-degree angle to create an A-frame shape with the back corner as the apex, lashing them together with paracord he'd scavenged from a sporting goods store 3 weeks earlier. The angle was critical, steep enough to shed condensation, shallow enough to create a small interior volume that their body heat could actually warm. "Big shelters waste energy," he explained to Lucas, who watched with the intense focus of a child learning something that mattered. "You want the smallest space you can physically fit into because your body is the furnace and the shelter is just the insulation around it. Every cubic foot of air you have to heat is energy you're taking from survival." The frame complete, Marcus began the critical layering that would mean the difference between life and death, and he narrated each step because teaching was the only legacy that mattered in the world the EMP had created. The first layer was the vapor barrier, the blue tarp they'd already been using, but positioned correctly on the outside of the structure, pulled tight and angled to direct condensation downward and away from the insulation layers beneath. "Moisture is your enemy," Marcus said, securing the tarp with rocks and broken concrete chunks. "Wet insulation is useless insulation. Water conducts heat 25 times faster than air, so even if your insulation is 6 inches thick, it's worthless if it's damp." Inside the tarp envelope, he packed the space between the pallet frame and the tarp with everything Sarah and the children had gathered: dried grass, pine needles, leaves, moss, creating a 6-inch thick layer of natural insulation that embodied the principle Marcus hammered home repeatedly. Insulation is trapped air. These leaves aren't doing anything special except creating thousands of tiny air pockets that prevent heat from escaping. That's what a down jacket does. That's what fiberglass insulation does. That's what a sleeping bag does. Same principle, different materials. Over the natural insulation, Marcus layered the foam pads, the carpet sections, and the moving blankets, creating a multi-layered thermal shell that reduced heat loss through convection and radiation. He explained the concept as he worked, knowing that understanding the why made people remember the how. "Your body radiates heat like a space heater," he told David, who was cutting carpet sections to size with a knife. "That radiant heat travels in infrared waves until it hits something, and most materials absorb that heat and conduct it away. But reflective materials and dense insulation layers bounce that heat back toward you, which is why emergency blankets are silver and why we're using these moving blankets as an inner layer." The shelter, taking shape in the corner, began to resemble a primitive bunker, maybe 4 feet wide by 6 feet deep, just tall enough to sit up inside, small and dark and warm, the polar opposite of the exposed lean-to that would have killed them. The final touch was the ground insulation inside the shelter itself, and Marcus used everything they had left. Bubble wrap as a vapor barrier directly on the cardboard floor, then foam pads, then the remainder of the carpet, creating a sleeping surface that was 3 inches of layered insulation between their bodies and the heat-sucking earth below. "You lose more heat to the ground than you think," Marcus said, helping Emma crawl inside to test the space. "Cold rises from the earth through conduction, and without proper ground insulation, you wake up hypothermic even if your shelter walls are perfect." He showed them how to arrange themselves inside, Emma and Lucas in the middle, Sarah and David on the outside, all 4 lying close together to share body heat, sleeping bags layered over them instead of inside them to create maximum loft and insulation. "Body heat is your only furnace," he explained. 4 people together can maintain a survivable temperature in this space. Separated, you each fight the cold alone and lose. By the time Marcus finished, 90 minutes had passed exactly as he'd predicted, and the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit according to the gauge he'd propped outside the garage door. The difference between the old shelter and the new one was the difference between death and survival, and Marcus made the Chen family understand this by having each person spend 60 seconds in the rebuilt shelter, then asking them to describe what they felt. Emma said it felt like a fort. Lucas said it was cozy. Sarah said she could feel warmth collecting, and David said nothing but his eyes had lost some of their desperation, which Marcus counted as victory. He walked them through the overnight protocol. No opening the entrance more than necessary. No sleeping in damp clothes. If someone needs to urinate, use a bottle rather than leaving the shelter. If condensation forms on the inside, wipe it away immediately before it soaks the insulation. Check on each other every few hours, Marcus instructed. If someone feels excessively cold, confused, or drowsy, that's hypothermia beginning. Wake everyone up, huddle together, generate heat through small movements. Marcus prepared to leave as the Chen family settled into their shelter, but Sarah stopped him with a question that changed everything. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" she asked, and Marcus gestured vaguely toward the neighborhood, mentioning a house he'd weatherized 3 miles away. Sarah exchanged looks with David, some non-verbal communication that marriage creates, and David spoke with genuine humility. "Stay here," he said. "We have food we can share, and you just saved our lives. Least we can do is offer dinner." Marcus started to decline. He'd survived 43 days by staying mobile and avoiding attachments. But Emma poked her head out of the shelter entrance and said, "Please stay, we have soup." And something in Marcus's chest that had frozen solid the day he found his sister's empty house began to crack slightly. He nodded once, agreeing to dinner if nothing else, and David retrieved a camping stove and propane canister from their supplies, while Sarah pulled out canned chicken soup that she heated with the careful rationing of someone who understood their food supply was finite. They ate together in the garage as night fell completely outside, the camping stove providing a tiny pool of light and residual warmth, and Marcus learned their story between spoonfuls of soup that tasted like civilization. David had been a senior developer at a tech startup. Sarah worked in marketing. They'd lived in a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs with a mortgage and a Subaru and college funds for the kids. And when the electromagnetic pulse hit during a normal Tuesday morning, they'd spent 2 weeks in denial, waiting for the government to fix things before accepting that the government no longer existed. They'd survived this long on canned food from their pantry and neighbors' abandoned homes, bottled water from Costco, and the camping gear they'd accumulated for vacations they'd always planned, but rarely took. Lucas told Marcus about his Xbox and his soccer team and his 5th-grade teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, who'd tried to keep their class together for a week after the collapse before disappearing one morning. Emma, speaking with the unself-conscious honesty of 6-year-olds, said she missed her goldfish and her best friend Zoe and the playground at school. And Marcus felt the weight of a world ended pressing against his ribs. When David asked Marcus his story, the question hung in the garage like frost crystallizing, and Marcus found himself speaking truths he'd kept locked away for 43 days. He told them about his sister Gabriella, 9 years younger, an environmental scientist studying salmon populations in Vancouver, how he'd promised their mother before she died that he'd always look after his little sister. He described the frantic journey north after the EMP, the empty house with signs of hurried packing, the note on the kitchen counter saying she was heading to a research station in the interior with her team, the weeks he'd spent searching while the world collapsed around him, and the radiation zones expanded, and the temperature dropped, and hope died by degrees. He explained his military background without glorifying it, the survival courses he'd taught at Camp Pendleton, the knowledge that felt useless now because you couldn't teach people who were already dead. Marcus heard his voice crack when he mentioned finding children's bodies in houses where parents had tried to shelter in place, and Sarah reached across the garage to grip his shoulder with the understanding of someone who'd also seen too much. The conversation drifted toward practical matters as the temperature outside dropped to 11 degrees and the wind intensified, and Marcus shared the information they needed to survive tomorrow and the day after. He explained water purification using the SODIS method, clear plastic bottles filled with water, laid in direct sunlight for 6 hours, the UV radiation killing bacteria and viruses without fuel or filters. He described food preservation through freezing, which nature was currently providing for free, emphasizing the need to protect stores from desperate survivors who would kill for a can of beans. He talked about the refugee camps forming in the cities, the violence and disease spreading through populations that congregated without sanitation or organization, his philosophy of staying mobile and avoiding large groups. David asked about radiation from the nuclear plants that had melted down without cooling systems, and Marcus explained what he knew. The coastal winds pushed most fallout out to sea, but Hanford and Columbia had contaminated the interior, creating zones that would kill you in days if you didn't understand exposure limits and decay rates. As midnight approached and exhaustion pulled at all of them, Marcus made a decision that surprised himself. "I'll stay until morning," he said. "Make sure the shelter holds. Make sure you understand the maintenance." The relief on Sarah's face was immediate, and David nodded with gratitude that needed no words. And Marcus found himself helping tuck Emma and Lucas into the shelter he'd built, watching Sarah and David squeeze in beside them, closing the entrance with layered blankets that trapped the heat inside. He built his own shelter against the opposite wall, using the techniques he'd just demonstrated, a smaller version requiring less material, and as he settled into the dark cocoon and felt his body heat slowly warming the trapped air around him, Marcus thought about the choice he'd made tonight. He'd built shelters for dozens of people over the past 43 days, always leaving before dawn, never getting attached, keeping his heart frozen against the losses that would inevitably come. But something about this family, David's humility after being wrong, Sarah's fierce protection of her children, Lucas's hunger to learn, Emma's unself-conscious trust, had cracked the ice Marcus had used to insulate himself from caring. The night passed with the sound of wind battering the garage door and the occasional creak of metal contracting in the cold, and Marcus woke 4 times to check the shelter temperature and listen for the telltale sounds of hypothermia in the Chen family. Each time he heard only the soft breathing of people sleeping deeply for the first time in weeks, the shelter maintaining its thermal integrity, the principles of insulation and heat retention proving themselves against the brutal physics of a post-apocalyptic winter. When dawn finally broke through the gaps in the garage door, Marcus emerged from his shelter to find the temperature had bottomed out at 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Lethal cold that would have killed the Chen family in their original lean-to within 4 hours. David crawled out of the rebuilt shelter, looking more rested than he had any right to be, and the first words he spoke were, "Teach us everything you know." Marcus spent the morning demonstrating fire-starting techniques because heat meant survival and cooking and water purification, and the psychological comfort of light in the darkness. He showed them the bow drill method, friction-based and requiring no matches or lighters, using a curved stick and a shoelace, and a flat board, and a spindle carved from dry wood. The physics of friction converting mechanical energy to heat energy until an ember glowed in the tinder bundle of dried grass and cedar bark. Lucas watched with absolute focus as Marcus demonstrated the hand position, the downward pressure, the speed of the bow stroke, and when the 10-year-old produced his first ember after 40 minutes of struggle, the pride in his eyes was worth more than any words could express. Marcus taught them to identify fatwood, resinous pine wood that would burn even when wet, found in the stumps of dead trees where sap had concentrated, and showed them how to split it into thin shavings that caught spark easily and burned hot enough to ignite larger fuel. He explained the fire triangle that everyone learned in school, but few understood in practice. Fuel, oxygen, and heat, with the proportions mattering as much as the components themselves. Small fuel catches easily, but burns fast, he explained, building a demonstration fire in a metal trash can. Large fuel burns long, but needs established heat to ignite. You build from tinder to kindling to fuel wood in graduated sizes, each layer igniting the next. Sarah asked about food, specifically how to make their remaining supplies last, and Marcus walked her through preservation techniques that had kept humans alive for millennia before refrigeration. He showed her how to identify safe foods in abandoned homes, anything canned or dried, nothing frozen unless still frozen solid, nothing that smelled wrong or showed signs of bloating or mold. He demonstrated solar drying using their tarp and direct sunlight, explaining how removing moisture prevented bacterial growth and made food shelf-stable for months. He described the root cellar principle, using the Earth's natural temperature stability to keep food cool without power, identifying the ideal location as the northeast corner of a basement where the sun never reached. "You want temperature between 32 and 40 degrees, Marcus said. Humidity around 90% for root vegetables, and darkness to prevent sprouting. The Earth provides all three if you dig deep enough and choose your location wisely." He taught her to render fat from any meat they scavenged, explaining that calories from fat were dense and necessary for survival in cold weather, that their bodies would crave fat instinctively, and she should trust that craving. By midday, a sound interrupted their lessons. Voices approaching from outside, multiple people moving through the neighborhood, and Marcus's hand went instinctively to the knife on his belt. David moved protectively toward the shelter where Emma and Lucas waited, and Sarah stood frozen with the tension of someone who'd learned to fear strangers. Marcus held up a hand for silence and eased toward the garage door, peering through a crack to assess the approaching group. What he saw made him relax slightly. 3 adults and 2 children, carrying backpacks and moving with the exhausted shuffle of refugees rather than the aggressive purpose of raiders. An older black man led the group, maybe 60 years old, wearing glasses held together with duct tape and carrying a walking stick. Beside him walked a young Hispanic woman, mid-20s, with a toddler strapped to her back. The third adult was a white man in his 40s, with a bandaged arm and the haunted eyes Marcus had seen in combat veterans. And holding his good hand was a girl about Emma's age, with Asian features and a stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. Marcus made the decision quickly, stepping out of the garage with his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, calling out a greeting before they got close enough to be startled. "Got shelter here if you need it," he said, and the relief that washed over the older man's face was profound. His name was James Washington, retired civil engineer, and he'd been leading this small group south from Seattle for 2 weeks, following Interstate 5, because the highway at least provided navigation and occasional shelter. The young woman was Sofia Martinez, 24 years old, her toddler son Diego strapped to her back in a carrier she'd fashioned from a jacket, his father lost in the riots that had consumed downtown Seattle when the food ran out. The injured man was Carl Peterson, former accountant, arm broken in a fall 3 days ago and set imperfectly, fighting infection. And the girl with the rabbit was May, and Carl wouldn't talk about her parents. But James said quietly that they'd found her alone in a burned house 5 days ago. Marcus saw David and Sarah exchange looks as the refugees approached, some calculation happening about resources and risk, and he saw the moment they decided to help, because that's what humans did when they remembered their humanity. The garage became a temporary shelter for 8 people, and Marcus spent the afternoon rebuilding and expanding the sleeping area, teaching David and James the shelter principles while they worked. They constructed a second A-frame shelter against the opposite wall, using the same techniques Marcus had demonstrated the previous night. And James contributed engineering knowledge that improved the design, calculating angles for optimal space efficiency, suggesting support beams to increase stability, proposing a ventilation system using PVC pipe to bring in fresh air without losing heat. The collaboration felt like the beginning of something important, and Marcus recognized the foundation of what could become a community rather than just isolated survivors. Sophia proved invaluable with medical knowledge from nursing school she'd abandoned to raise Diego, and she examined Carl's arm with gentle competence before declaring that the break was healing correctly, but the infection required treatment beyond their capabilities. Marcus showed her how to make willow bark tea, explaining the salicylic acid content that made it nature's aspirin, and Sophia added knowledge about yarrow for blood clotting and plantain for drawing infection, creating a synthesis of traditional and modern medical understanding. As evening approached and the temperature began its inevitable drop, Marcus taught the expanded group his evening protocol for survival. They gathered dried wood during daylight hours, storing it inside the garage to keep it dry and accessible. They filled every container they had with snow, bringing it inside to melt naturally using ambient heat rather than wasting fuel. They conducted an inventory of food supplies, pooling resources, and calculating consumption rates. 8 people could survive 12 days on what they had if they rationed strictly, less if they encountered more refugees. Marcus demonstrated the buddy system, each adult responsible for checking one other person through the night, watching for signs of hypothermia, confusion, excessive cold. He explained the signs of carbon monoxide poisoning because desperation made people do stupid things like burning charcoal indoors, and he showed them how to properly ventilate any enclosed space where combustion occurred. Dinner that night was communal, everyone contributing what they had: canned soup, crackers, some beef jerky James had been hoarding, instant coffee that Sophia brewed with melted snow, and the garage filled with conversation and something approaching normalcy. Lucas and May discovered they both loved dinosaurs and spent an hour comparing favorites, while Emma taught Diego to stack blocks made from scavenged wood. David and James discussed engineering projects, fantasizing about rebuilding infrastructure once spring came. Sarah and Sophia traded stories about motherhood in the apocalypse, the fear and exhaustion and fierce protectiveness that defined their days. Carl sat quietly by the fire, his injured arm cradled against his chest, and Marcus saw the 1,000-yard stare of trauma that would take years to heal if it healed at all. As darkness fell and the wind rose again, Marcus found himself sitting with James near the camping stove, and the older man asked the question everyone wondered, but few spoke aloud. "Do you think civilization comes back?" James said. "Or is this it forever?" Marcus considered his answer carefully, because hope and honesty both mattered. "I think we're the civilization now," he finally said. 8 people in a garage, sharing soup and teaching each other to survive. Multiply that by 10,000 groups across the country, and you have the foundation of whatever comes next. Won't look like what we lost, but it could be something better if we choose to build it that way. James nodded slowly, looking at the children playing in the firelight, the adults working together, the small community forming from necessity and choosing to stay together by choice. "Then I guess we better make sure we survive the winter," he said, and Marcus agreed. "Then we better make sure we survive the winter." The night brought temperatures down to 6 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest yet, and Marcus lay in his shelter listening to the wind howl and the metal contract and the soft sounds of 8 people breathing in sleep, and he thought about the choice that faced him in the morning. He could leave as he'd always done, continue his pattern of teaching and moving, staying unattached and uncommitted. Or he could stay with this group, invest in their survival, build something that might last beyond winter. The decision felt enormous in the darkness, weighted with implications he couldn't fully calculate. He thought about his sister Gabriella, wondering if she was alive, if she'd found community, if she was making the same choice to stay with a group of survivors rather than wander alone. He thought about the Marine Corps values he'd internalized: honor, courage, commitment, and what those words meant when there was no corps to serve. No country to defend, only small groups of humans trying to survive in a world that wanted them dead. When morning came and brought weak sunlight filtered through perpetual ash clouds, Marcus made his choice before he could overthink it. He told the group he would stay for another day, teach them more, help them establish systems that would last after he left. David smiled with knowing understanding, and Sarah handed him a cup of instant coffee without comment, and James simply nodded as if he'd expected nothing else. But Marcus saw his decision reflected in the children's faces: Lucas eager for more lessons, Emma bringing him her stuffed bear to meet, May holding up a pine cone she'd found and asking if it was useful. And he understood that leaving had stopped being an option the moment he'd chosen to care whether these people survived. The second day brought structure and routine, the foundations of civilization rebuilt in miniature. Marcus organized the group into teams with specific responsibilities: David and James on shelter improvement and maintenance, Sarah and Sophia on food preparation and medical care, Carl on watch duty despite his injury because everyone needed purpose and his eyes were sharp. The children received their own assignments: Lucas in charge of firewood gathering, Emma and May collecting tinder and kindling, Diego helping his mother sort supplies by pointing to things she named. Marcus rotated between teams, teaching and demonstrating and correcting, and the garage began to transform from desperate shelter into something approaching a base camp. The water situation needed addressing, and Marcus led David and James to a stream half a mile away, teaching them to identify safe water sources and purification methods beyond SODIS. He showed them how to build a simple charcoal filter using layers of sand, gravel and charcoal crushed from their campfire, explaining how activated charcoal absorbed contaminants and heavy metals. They constructed the filter in a plastic bottle with the bottom cut off, suspended upside down over a collection container, and Marcus demonstrated the flow rate and clarity improvement, though he emphasized that filtration didn't kill bacteria and still required boiling or SODIS treatment afterward. "Layered defense," he explained. "You filter sediment and chemicals, then you kill biological contaminants. Never trust a single method when your life depends on water safety." By the third day, the group had established patterns that suggested long-term viability. Morning began with fire-building practice for the children, each learning the technique under Marcus's supervision. Breakfast was communal and rationed precisely. The adults scattered to daily tasks, gathering, improving shelters, reinforcing the garage against wind, creating additional insulation layers. Lunch was simple and fast. Afternoons brought lessons from Marcus on various survival topics: how to read weather signs in the ash-darkened sky, how to navigate using the sun's position when visible, how to identify edible plants even in winter, how to set snares for rabbits and squirrels that were also struggling to survive. Dinner became the community gathering time, everyone sharing what they'd learned or accomplished, the children telling stories, the adults making plans. The fourth day brought the first real test. A group of refugees passed by the neighborhood, maybe 20 people moving south in desperate hunger, and the decision whether to hide or help split the garage community down the middle. Carl argued for hiding, his trauma making him see threats everywhere. James advocated for selective help, sharing information but not depleting their resources. Sophia wanted to help everyone, her nursing instinct overriding survival calculation. David deferred to Marcus, recognizing superior experience, and Marcus found himself in the role he'd spent 43 days avoiding, leader of a community that looked to him for decisions that meant life or death. He chose a middle path, approaching the refugee group alone, with his hands visible and offering information. A map he'd drawn showing areas with standing water, houses that still had canned food, dangerous zones with radiation or violent survivors, the location of a church 10 miles south where a larger community was reportedly forming. He offered nothing from the garage's supplies, but gave knowledge freely. And the refugees' leader, a woman named Chen, who laughed bitterly at the coincidence of sharing David's last name, thanked him with the dignity of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness. They moved on, and Marcus returned to find his community divided between those who thought he'd helped too much and those who thought he'd helped too little. And he understood that leadership in the apocalypse meant making decisions that satisfied no one, but might keep everyone alive. That night, Marcus taught the group about community dynamics and the psychology of survival. Lessons the Marines had drilled into him during leadership courses that now felt prophetic. He explained the rule of threes: 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in extreme conditions, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, but indefinitely without purpose. That last one kills more survivors than cold or hunger, Marcus said. People give up when they lose meaning, when they can't see a reason to keep struggling. That's why structure matters, why daily tasks matter, why we give the children responsibilities that matter. We're not just surviving, we're building something worth surviving for. Sarah asked how long they should plan to stay in the garage, and the question opened a larger discussion about spring and rebuilding and what came next. James talked about agriculture, the need to plant crops if they wanted food beyond scavenged cans. Sophia mentioned water purification at scale, the engineering challenges of providing clean water for a community. David wondered about communication, whether anyone was organizing coordination between survivor groups. Carl remained silent, his eyes haunted, and Marcus recognized the signs of someone breaking under the weight of loss. He made a mental note to spend time with Carl individually, knowing that psychological survival required as much attention as physical survival. The 5th day, Marcus woke to find May standing beside his shelter, clutching her stuffed rabbit and crying silently. He emerged into the cold garage to find Carl gone, his supplies taken, a note left on the ground weighted by a rock. "Can't do this anymore," it read. "Take care of her." And Marcus felt fury and grief in equal measure, because suicide by walking into winter alone was still suicide. And now he had another child to protect, and Carl had been a good man, broken by a bad world. He gathered the community to share the news, and they held an impromptu memorial for a man they'd known less than a week. And May cried while Emma and Lucas held her hands, and Marcus wondered how many more losses they could endure before someone else broke. The day passed in somber work, but by evening the community had adjusted to accommodate May permanently into their structure. Sarah became her de facto guardian, May responding to maternal warmth after trauma, and the two girls became inseparable in the way of children who find friendship in shared circumstances. Marcus used Carl's departure as a teaching moment, gathering everyone for a discussion about mental health and communal responsibility. "Watch each other," he said. "Depression, hopelessness, despair, these are as dangerous as hypothermia. If someone's withdrawing, if they're giving away supplies, if they're talking about giving up, you intervene. We don't survive alone, and we don't let anyone fall alone either." By the 6th day, Marcus realized he'd stayed longer than he'd stayed anywhere since the collapse, and more importantly, he'd stopped thinking about leaving. The community of 8, soon to be 7 with Carl's death, then 8 again as they folded May into their number, had become something that resembled family, or the closest approximation the apocalypse allowed. He watched David teaching Lucas to use tools, Sarah showing the girls how to sort supplies efficiently, James mentoring the whole group with engineering insights, Sophia tending to Diego while simultaneously managing medical care for everyone. And Marcus saw the resilience that would determine whether humanity survived this catastrophe. They weren't perfect. They fought over resources and made mistakes and sometimes gave up in small ways. But they kept choosing to stay together, to help each other, to build something from nothing. On the 7th day, Marcus noted the biblical significance and chose to see it as symbolic rather than religious. The community decided collectively to make the garage their permanent winter base rather than continuing to move. They spent the day reinforcing structures, expanding storage, creating better ventilation systems, and establishing territorial boundaries for the surrounding neighborhood. James proposed a radical idea. Instead of just surviving winter, they should prepare for spring planting, which meant securing seeds, identifying farmable land, and recruiting additional members who had agricultural knowledge. Sophia supported the idea, suggesting they could offer medical care to other survivor groups in exchange for food or skills. David wanted to establish a communication network, proposing a dead drop system using marked locations where groups could leave messages for each other. Marcus listened to the proposals and recognized the shift from survival mode to rebuilding mode, and he felt something he hadn't felt since the electromagnetic pulse destroyed the world. Hope that approached sustainable rather than desperate. The weather broke on the 8th day, temperatures rising to almost 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the community emerged from the garage to assess winter's damage to the neighborhood. What they found was simultaneously devastating and promising. Houses collapsed under snow weight, cars buried in drifts, frozen bodies in homes where people had failed to maintain heat, but also signs of other survivors, smoke from chimneys indicating other groups, paths through snow showing regular travel, messages spray-painted on walls indicating safe houses and dangerous areas. Marcus led a scavenging expedition, taking David and James while Sarah and Sophia maintained the base camp, and they returned with critical supplies. Seeds from a garden center, a first aid kit from a clinic, solar panels ripped from a house roof, and most importantly, a hand-crank radio that still functioned after they'd cleaned the contacts and jury-rigged a battery from scavenged cells. That night they gathered around the radio, tuning through static for any sign of organized survival, and found a scratchy signal broadcasting from somewhere east. A woman's voice, professional and calm, reading coordinates for supply drops, locations of functioning communities, warnings about radiation zones and dangerous groups. The broadcast repeated every hour, automated and impersonal, but it meant something bigger existed beyond their small garage community, some structure attempting to reorganize civilization from the ruins. Marcus wrote down the coordinates for the nearest functioning community, 60 miles south, beyond the radiation zones, but within possible travel distance, and the group spent hours debating whether to send scouts, attempt contact, or remain independent and isolated. The decision to attempt contact came from an unexpected source. May, speaking for the first time since Carl's departure, said simply, "We should help other people like you helped us." Her words cut through the debate, reminding everyone that isolation was survival, but community was living. And they decided to send a two-person team south once weather permitted, carrying supplies to trade and knowledge to share, seeking connection with whatever civilization was struggling to emerge from collapse. Marcus volunteered immediately, and James insisted on accompanying him despite his age, and they began planning an expedition that would determine whether this small community could become part of something larger or would remain isolated until supplies ran out and winter returned. The 9th and 10th days were consumed by preparation, gathering supplies for travel, creating maps based on the radio broadcast and Marcus's own exploration, teaching Sarah and Sophia enough survival techniques to maintain the garage community during their absence, ensuring the children understood their responsibilities. Lucas took his promotion to deputy leader with endearing seriousness, and Emma created a flag for their community, a piece of blue tarp with a yellow sun painted in Sophia's nail polish that she declared would fly outside the garage to mark them as friendly to other survivors. Diego, too young to understand, but old enough to sense importance, carefully touched everything they packed, as if bestowing blessings. On the 11th day, Marcus and James prepared to depart at dawn, but an unexpected arrival changed everything. A young woman appeared at the garage entrance, maybe 18 years old. Korean features, carrying a medical bag and wearing a mask that suggested healthcare training. And when she lowered the mask, her first words stopped Marcus's heart mid-beat. "I'm looking for Marcus Rivera. His sister Gabriela sent me." The garage fell silent, every person freezing as the implications hit, and Marcus felt 43 days of grief and hope and desperate wondering crash over him like a breaking wave. "She's alive," he managed to say, and the young woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Mina Park, medical resident who'd been part of Gabriela's research team, nodded with a smile that seemed impossibly bright in the garage's dim interior. "She's alive, and she's been looking for you since the collapse. She's leading a community 200 miles north near the research station, and I volunteered to head south to search. She knew you'd be moving, teaching people to survive, probably working your way north when you could. She told me to look for communities that had better shelters than they should, with someone teaching them things they wouldn't know otherwise." The joy that flooded through Marcus was physical, weakening his knees and blurring his vision. And he felt Sarah's hand on his shoulder steadying him, and heard James saying something congratulatory, and saw the children cheering without fully understanding why. "Doctor." Park had more news. Gabriela's community consisted of nearly 200 survivors, including scientists, engineers, families, children, and they'd established sustainable food production in geothermal greenhouses, had working medical facilities, were beginning to manufacture simple electronics and tools. They were sending scouts south to make contact with other communities, offering medical assistance and sharing knowledge, attempting to create a network of connected groups that could support each other through winter and beyond. "She wants you to come north," Mina said directly to Marcus. "She needs experienced survival instructors to train people being sent out to help other groups. But she also said she'd understand if you'd found your own community here, if you'd chosen to stay with people who needed you." Marcus looked around the garage at the community he'd helped create. David and Sarah with their children, James with his engineering knowledge, Sophia with Diego, May healing slowly from trauma, and he understood the choice before him with perfect clarity. He could go north to his sister, reunite with family, join a large community with resources and safety. leave behind the small group he'd spent 11 days teaching and protecting, or he could stay here, continue the work he'd begun, help this community survive and grow, maintain the connections he'd built, and trust that his sister was alive and safe, and would understand. The decision felt impossible until he realized it wasn't his decision alone, and he turned to the group and asked simply, "What do you want to do?" What followed was a conversation that lasted until dawn. 8 people, 7 adults and Lucas, who at 10 years old had earned a voice, discussing options and possibilities and fears and hopes. David wanted to move north, seeing the larger community as offering better chances for Emma and Lucas's future. Sarah feared the journey's danger, preferring known shelter over uncertain travel. James argued for staying independent, building strength before joining larger groups. Sophia desperately wanted medical facilities for Diego's sake, knowing children needed resources this garage couldn't provide. Missy said quietly that she'd follow wherever May went, which made Sarah cry and hug her tightly. Mina listened without judgment, then shared crucial information. The northern community had trucks making supply runs, could send vehicles to collect groups too large to travel on foot, had protocols for safely transporting children and elderly through radiation zones. By morning's light, the decision emerged through consensus rather than voting. They would travel north as a community, joining Gabriella's larger group but maintaining their identity and independence, offering their skills, Marcus's teaching, James's engineering, Sophia's medical training, David's technical knowledge, in exchange for inclusion and support. They would take 2 weeks to prepare, gathering supplies and winterizing the garage as a way station for future refugees, leaving signs and information for other survivors who might find it, creating a chain of shelter that extended southward from the northern community. Marcus felt the rightness of the decision in his bones, understanding that survival meant more than staying alive. It meant choosing growth over stagnation, community over isolation, hope over fear. The 2 weeks passed in controlled chaos, the garage community preparing for migration while simultaneously teaching other nearby survivor groups what they'd learned, spreading Marcus's knowledge like seeds planted for future harvest. They established contact with the radio broadcast, confirming transport arrangements. They collected every useful item from a 2-mile radius, creating supply caches for refugees who would come after. They held nightly gatherings where Marcus taught survival techniques to anyone who appeared, watching his knowledge multiply through grateful learners who would share it further. The children created a guidebook, Lucas writing with careful printing, Emma drawing illustrations, May adding details she remembered, documenting everything Marcus had taught about shelter, fire, water, and hope. On the 14th day, 2 trucks arrived from the north, modified to run on vegetable oil biodiesel and carrying spare fuel, food, medical supplies, and something Marcus hadn't seen since the collapse. Professional relief workers wearing clean clothes and offering assistance without desperation. They brought news that dozens of communities were forming, that communication networks were being established, that agriculture was being planned for spring, that civilization was choosing to rebuild rather than surrender to extinction. They brought letters from Gabriella, 3 of them, written at different times, each expressing love and hope and the determination to find her brother or die trying. And Marcus read them in the privacy of his small shelter and wept for the first time since the electromagnetic pulse had destroyed the world and his sister had disappeared. The journey north took 4 days, traveling in convoy with other refugee groups, moving through landscape that looked alien under ash-darkened skies and covering snow, passing through abandoned cities and ravaged towns and improvised graveyards, where survivors had honored their dead with markers and memory. The children handled the journey better than adults, excited by the movement and the promise of something better, while the adults struggled with leaving familiar territory, even when that territory was defined by hardship. Marcus spent the journey teaching and answering questions and helping other groups solve problems that arose, and he watched his community of 8 become part of a network of hundreds, all moving north toward the hope that Gabriela and others had built from nothing and determination. The northern community appeared on the 4th day as a cluster of structures surrounding a geothermal plant that still generated power. Greenhouse complexes that glowed with the impossible green of growing plants, solar panels and wind turbines, and smoke rising from chimneys. And Marcus felt his throat tighten, seeing what humans could accomplish when they chose cooperation over competition, building over destruction, hope over despair. The truck stopped at the entrance, and Marcus saw a woman running toward them, 35 years old, dark hair escaping from a braid, wearing coveralls stained with garden soil, and he knew his sister before she was close enough to see clearly, knew her from the way she moved, the determined sprint, the refusal to wait another moment when they'd already waited 43 days of hell. They met halfway between the trucks and the community, and Gabriela crashed into Marcus with the force of someone who'd been running toward this moment since the world ended. And he held his sister while they both cried and laughed and didn't speak because words couldn't contain what they felt, the relief and gratitude and fierce love that had survived the apocalypse when so much else had died. When they finally pulled apart, still holding hands, Gabriela looked at the trucks full of refugees that Marcus had helped survive, and she smiled with the pride of someone who knew her brother had done exactly what she would have expected. "You saved them," she said, and Marcus shook his head, correcting gently. "We saved each other. That's how this works now." "Udi." The weeks that followed brought integration into the northern community, and Marcus discovered his sister had become a leader of substance and vision, organizing agriculture and resource distribution and conflict resolution with the same determination she'd brought to studying salmon populations. She'd built something that resembled the best of pre-collapse civilization: democratic decision-making, equitable resource sharing, protection of vulnerable populations, education for children, medical care for all, while accepting the realities of their situation without illusion or denial. Marcus found his place as head of the survival training program, teaching groups of young adults who would travel south to help other communities, spreading knowledge that saved lives and built connections between scattered survivors, attempting to rebuild civilization from fragments. David Chen became an electronics specialist, working with engineers to rebuild communication systems using scavenged parts and improvised manufacturing. Sarah joined the community council, representing families with young children, ensuring that resources flowed to education and childcare. James collaborated with other engineers on infrastructure projects, designing water systems and shelter improvements that would serve hundreds. Sophia worked in the medical clinic, her nursing knowledge combined with pre-collapse doctors, creating healthcare capacity that drew refugees from hundreds of miles. The children flourished in ways that broke and mended hearts simultaneously. Lucas learning engineering, alongside James, Emma and May, inseparable friends attending school with 40 other children. Diego growing up in a world that might eventually recover. Marcus trained dozens of survival instructors over the months that followed, sending them south with knowledge and supplies, and the mandate to help other communities survive. And he watched the network grow like a web spinning across the Pacific Northwest, connecting isolated groups into something that approached organized survival. He heard stories from his students about communities they'd helped, lives they'd saved, techniques they'd taught, and he understood that the work he'd begun in that garage, teaching the Chen family to build proper shelter, had multiplied exponentially, spreading through survivor networks until thousands of people were benefiting from principles he'd learned in the Marines and refined through 43 days of desperate necessity. Spring came eventually, and with it the massive challenge of agriculture, planting seeds in soil contaminated by ash and radiation, gambling everything on the hope that crops would grow and winter wouldn't return too early, and the knowledge needed for farming hadn't died with those who held it. Marcus worked alongside his sister in the geothermal greenhouses, and they talked during the long hours of planting about the world they'd lost and the world they were building, about their parents who hadn't survived to see this, about the responsibility they felt to honor every person who died by refusing to let humanity go extinct. Gabriella shared her philosophy of rebuilding. We can't recreate what we lost, but we can build something better. Every mistake civilization made before, every injustice and inequality and waste, we have a chance to not repeat. This is terrible, Marcus. All of this is terrible, but it's also an opportunity to rebuild better. By summer, when the first crops emerged from the soil and proved that agriculture was possible in the post-collapse world, the northern community had grown to nearly 500 people, with satellite communities forming to the south and east, all connected through communication networks and trade relationships, and the shared goal of surviving until civilization could properly rebuild. Marcus continued training instructors, but he also began documenting everything he knew, working with teachers to create written manuals and visual guides that could outlast any individual teacher, preserving survival knowledge for the generations that would come after. He thought often about the winter night in the garage when he'd built shelter for the Chen family, how close he'd come to walking away, how different his life would be if he'd maintained his isolation and refused to care. On the anniversary of the electromagnetic pulse, 365 days after the world ended, and humans began the slow work of putting it back together, the northern community held a memorial service for everyone they'd lost, reading names when names were known, and acknowledging the countless unnamed dead with silence and sorrow and determination that their deaths would not be meaningless. Marcus stood with his sister and the community he'd helped save, surrounded by hundreds of people who existed because someone had chosen to help them. And he thought about Carl, who'd given up, about the refugees he'd met and helped and sent on their way, about the children who would grow up in a world Marcus was helping to rebuild, and he felt the weight and purpose of survival pressing against his chest like a physical force. The closing came during the evening gathering, when Marcus stood before the community and shared the lesson he'd learned over the past year, the truth that had sustained him through dark nights and desperate days, and the constant fear that everything would fail. When the world ended, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled survivors, I thought survival meant knowledge and skills and physical preparation, and those things matter. They absolutely matter. But what I learned in that garage, teaching one family to build shelter, was that survival is fundamentally about community and connection, and the choice to help each other even when it costs us something. Your shelter will fail in the first night after the apocalypse if you build it alone, if you trust only yourself, if you refuse to learn from others or teach others what you know. But if you build together, if you share knowledge and resources and hope, if you choose community over isolation, then the shelter you build can hold not just through one night, but through winter, through disaster, through whatever comes next. We survived the apocalypse by surviving together, and we'll rebuild civilization the same way. The applause that followed was quiet but sustained, and afterward dozens of people approached Marcus to share their stories, to thank him for teaching them or their instructors, to tell him about communities they'd helped or people they'd saved, and he listened to each person with the full attention they deserved, understanding that these stories were the legacy of choosing to care, to teach, to believe that humanity was worth saving, even when the world suggested otherwise. As the evening gathering dispersed and people returned to their homes, real homes now, with walls and roofs and heat and the beginnings of normalcy, Marcus found himself standing with Gabriela under the ash-darkened sky that was slowly clearing as nature healed from the wounds humans had inflicted. "You think we're going to make it?" Gabriela asked, the question honest and unguarded, and Marcus considered his answer carefully before responding. "I think we're making it right now," he said. "Every day we survive is making it. Every person we help is making it. Every child who learns and grows is making it. The question isn't whether we'll make it. The question is what we're making, what kind of world we're building from these ruins. And I think, if we choose right, if we remember what we learned from the collapse, we might build something better than what we lost." Gabriela leaned against her brother's shoulder, and they stood together watching the community they'd built, preparing for another night, another tomorrow, another chance to choose survival and hope, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender to extinction. And Marcus thought about the message he'd want to share with anyone listening, anyone watching this story unfold, anyone surviving their own apocalypse in whatever form it took. "If you're watching this from somewhere," Marcus said quietly, though whether he was speaking to his sister or to some imagined audience beyond, even he wasn't certain. "Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is where you're listening to this story, know that you're not alone in this. We're all survivors of something, whether it's the literal collapse of civilization or the personal apocalypses that break our lives apart. And the same principles apply. Build shelter that actually protects you. Learn skills that save lives, connect with other people, teach what you know, accept help when it's offered, offer help when you can, choose community over isolation, choose hope over despair, choose to build even when destruction seems easier." Tell me in the comments where you are, what time it is, what you're surviving, because knowing we're not alone in this makes the darkness less dark and the cold less cold. And together we survive what would kill us alone.